She wasn't remarkable, not in the way that draws attention in a place like this. She didn't possess the classical beauty that might turn heads in the marketplace, nor did she carry herself with the kind of presence that demands notice. She was ordinary, quiet, efficient. The kind of person who blends into the background, who becomes part of the scenery, invisible in plain sight. Before we proceed, please tell me your name, the city you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Her name was irrelevant to most. Just another face in the sea of servants who kept the palace running, who polished the marble floors until they gleamed, who ensured that every candle was lit before nightfall, who changed the linens and prepared the meals and existed solely to serve. The Alpha King had barely noticed her. Why would he? In his world, servants were furniture. Necessary, functional, but not worthy of his attention. He had kingdoms to rule, wars to prevent, alliances to forge. What did it matter who folded his clothes or swept his chambers? But somewhere along the way something changed. It was subtle at first, so subtle that he didn't even recognize it for what it was. A glance that lingered a fraction of a second too long. A strange awareness of her presence when she entered a room. The unconscious way his gaze would seek her out among the other servants, even when he told himself he had no reason to do so. He told himself it meant nothing. That it was merely idle observation, the kind of passive awareness one develops for familiar objects in familiar spaces. Nothing more. He was lying to himself, of course. But the Alpha King had become exceptionally good at self-deception over the years. It's one of the skills you develop when you rule alone, when vulnerability is weakness and weakness is death. And then one evening something shifted. It was late autumn, the kind of evening when the wind carries the promise of winter and the palace halls grow cold despite the roaring fires in every hearth. The Alpha King had just concluded a particularly draining council meeting, the kind where men argued in circles for hours without reaching any meaningful conclusion. He was walking back to his chambers, his mind still churning through the political intricacies and power plays that defined his existence. That's when he saw her. She was standing in one of the side corridors, partially hidden in shadow. She held something in her hands, a small object he couldn't quite make out from his position. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was her posture. Tense, alert, almost furtive. As he watched, she glanced around nervously as if checking to ensure she wasn't being observed. Then, with quick, practiced movements, she slipped whatever she was holding into the pocket of her apron and hurried down the corridor, disappearing around a corner. It was nothing. A servant going about her business. Perhaps she had pocketed some small trinket or a letter from a lover, or any of 1,000 innocent things. There was no reason for the Alpha King to give it a second thought. And yet, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. Over the following days he found himself watching her more carefully. Not obviously, the Alpha King was nothing if not subtle when he chose to be. But he observed. And what he observed began to trouble him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He was distracted. That was the first thing he noticed. The woman who had always moved through her duties with quiet efficiency now seemed elsewhere in her thoughts. She would pause in the middle of tasks, staring at nothing, her expression distant and troubled. More than once he'd seen her startle when someone approached, as if pulled from some deep reverie. Then there were the phone calls. The servants were permitted limited use of their personal phones during designated breaks. It was a modern concession in an otherwise traditional household. But recently he'd noticed her slipping away during odd hours, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Whenever someone approached, she would quickly end the call, her face flushing with what looked like guilt or perhaps fear. Who was she talking to? And why did she seem so desperate to keep those conversations private? The rational part of the Alpha King's mind told him this was none of his concern. Servants had personal lives. They had relationships, problems, secrets. It was natural. Normal. He had no right and no reason to pry into her affairs. But there was another part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, that felt something altogether different. Something that tasted uncomfortably like jealousy. Like possessiveness. Like caring. And that was unacceptable. The Alpha King did not care about servants. He did not concern himself with the personal dramas of those beneath his station. He was above such petty emotional entanglements. He had to be. That was the price of the crown he wore, the burden of the power he wielded. But if that was true, then why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Why did her obvious distress gnaw at him in the quiet hours of the night? Why did he find himself listening for her footsteps in the corridors, tracking her movements through his palace like a hunter stalking prey? What was happening to him? The breaking point came on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after that first moment of observation. The Alpha King was in his study, reviewing reports that should have commanded his full attention but instead felt like meaningless words on paper. His mind was elsewhere. He heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Light, quick, familiar. Without thinking, he rose from his desk and moved to the door, opening it just in time to see her hurrying past, a cloak thrown over her servant's uniform, hood pulled up to partially obscure her face. Where was she going at this hour? Her shift had ended, yes, but something about her urgency, her obvious attempt at concealment, set off alarms in his mind. Before he could talk himself out of it, before the rational part of his brain could remind him how inappropriate this was, how far beneath his dignity, the Alpha King made a decision that would change everything. He followed her. Moving through his own palace like a thief in the night felt surreal. The Alpha King was not accustomed to sneaking, to hiding, to skulking in shadows. He commanded. He demanded. He took what he wanted and went where he pleased. But tonight he was following. Pursuing. Chasing something he couldn't even name. She moved quickly through the palace's lower levels, taking servants' passages that he rarely used but knew well enough to navigate. He kept his distance, using every skill he'd learned in his younger years as a warrior, before the crown had weighed him down with responsibility and ceremony. She never looked back. She was too focused on her destination, whatever it might be. They emerged from the palace through a side entrance used primarily for deliveries. The evening air was cold, sharp with the bite of approaching winter. The Alpha King pulled his own cloak tighter, grateful that its dark color helped him blend into the deepening shadows. She set off down the mountain path that led away from the palace grounds, moving with purpose now, no longer hurrying but walking with steady determination. Where could she possibly be going? The nearest village was miles away and night was falling fast. The Alpha King's mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. Was she meeting a lover? The thought sent an unexpected spike of anger through him. Was she involved in something illicit? Espionage? Betrayal? No, that was ridiculous. He was just a servant. What could she possibly have to offer spies or enemies? What secrets could she know? But then why this secrecy? Why this obvious deception? They walked for nearly half an hour, the path winding down from the mountain into the forested valley below. The last light was fading from the sky, replaced by the cold silver glow of a rising moon. The Alpha King's enhanced senses, a gift of his bloodline, allowed him to track her easily even in the growing darkness. Finally, she left the main path, turning onto a smaller trail that led deeper into the woods. The Alpha King hesitated. This was madness. He should turn back. Return to his palace, his duties, his carefully ordered life. But his feet carried him forward. Into the trees. Into the unknown. The forest here was old, the kind of old that whispers of magic and memory. Ancient oaks reached skyward like supplicants seeking benediction from distant stars. The undergrowth was thick but manageable, and the maid moved through it with the ease of someone who had traveled this path before. Many times before, the Alpha King realized with growing unease. How long had this been going on? What else had he failed to notice, too absorbed in his own world to see what was happening right under his nose? Ahead through the trees he saw light. Warm. Flickering. Fire or candles, he couldn't tell. The maid was heading straight for it, her pace quickening with what looked like eagerness or perhaps relief. The Alpha King moved closer, abandoning the path to circle through the denser undergrowth, using the trees for cover. His heart was pounding now, though whether from exertion or anticipation he couldn't say. Through the branches he could make out a small clearing. In its center stood a cottage, barely more than a cabin really, constructed from rough-hewn timber and stone. Light glowed in its windows, and smoke rose from its chimney in lazy spirals. The maid approached the door and knocked, 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. A code. A signal. The Alpha King felt his jaw clench. This was planned. Coordinated. Whatever was happening here, it was no casual encounter. The door opened and a figure appeared in the doorway. The Alpha King couldn't make out details from his position, but he could see enough. A man. Broad-shouldered. The maid said something the Alpha King couldn't hear, and then she stepped into the cottage. The door closed behind her, and the Alpha King was left alone in the dark forest, staring at that closed door, his mind a tempest of emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. Jealousy. Yes, that was there, hot and bitter in his throat. But there was something else too. Betrayal. As if she owed him loyalty beyond her service. As if she had broken some unspoken promise by having a life, relationships, secrets of her own. It was irrational. He knew it was irrational. But knowing something and feeling it are two very different things. He should leave. He should return to the palace and forget he'd ever seen this. It was none of his business. She was entitled to her privacy, her personal relationships, whatever they might be. But the Alpha King had not built an empire by walking away from mysteries. By leaving questions unanswered. By accepting ignorance when knowledge was within reach. He moved closer to the cottage, using every skill at his disposal to remain undetected. The windows were covered with thick curtains, but they weren't perfectly drawn. Through a narrow gap he could see into the cottage's main room. What he saw made his blood run cold. The man who had opened the door stood in the center of the room. The Alpha King could see him clearly now, illuminated by the fire burning in the hearth and the candles scattered throughout the space. He recognized that face. He knew it as well as he knew his own. It was impossible. It couldn't be. But there was no mistaking those features, that bearing, that presence. The man in the cottage was someone the Alpha King had believed dead for 5 years. Someone whose loss had nearly destroyed him. Someone whose betrayal had been the catalyst for the Alpha King's transformation from a man capable of feeling into the cold, controlled ruler he had become. His brother. The Alpha King's world tilted on its axis. His vision swam. For a moment he thought he might actually collapse, might fall to his knees right there in the dirt and leaves, undone by the impossibility of what he was witnessing. His brother. Alive. After all these years. After the funeral, the mourning, the bitter acceptance of loss. Alive. And meeting secretly with his maid in a hidden cottage in the forest, like conspirators planning treason. The Alpha King's mind raced backward through time, through memory, trying to make sense of the senseless. His brother had been his closest companion, his most trusted advisor, his friend. They had grown up together in the shadow of their father's crown, trained together, fought together, ruled together after their father's death. The Alpha King had loved his brother more than anyone else in the world, had trusted him with everything. And then had come the accusation. Evidence of betrayal, of conspiracy with their enemies, of plans to usurp the throne. The evidence had been overwhelming, undeniable. The Alpha King's counselors had demanded execution. Death for treason. But the Alpha King couldn't do it. Couldn't order the death of his own brother no matter what he'd done. So he'd offered an alternative. Exile. Permanent, irrevocable exile from the kingdom, from the family, from everything they'd known. His brother had refused. Had chosen death instead, claiming he would rather die than live in disgrace and exile. They'd found his body 3 days later. Or what they'd assumed was his body. It had been burned beyond recognition in what looked like a funeral pyre. The Alpha King had taken it as a final act of defiance, a way for his brother to control his own end. He'd mourned. God's how he'd mourned. But the mourning had eventually hardened into bitterness, into a determination never to be so vulnerable again, never to trust so completely, never to love so foolishly. And now, here in this impossible moment, all of that carefully constructed emotional armor was crumbling to dust. Because his brother was alive. Had been alive all along. And somehow, impossibly, the maid, his maid, was connected to this deception. Through the window he watched as his brother and the maid talked. He couldn't hear their words, but he could read their body language. Familiarity. Intimacy. Trust. How long had she known? How long had she been lying to him, serving him day after day while harboring this monumental secret? His brother gestured and the maid shook her head. They seemed to be arguing about something. The Alpha King pressed closer to the window, desperate to hear, to understand. That's when his brother's gaze suddenly shifted, locking directly onto the window where the Alpha King stood hidden in shadow. For a moment time froze. The brothers stared at each other across the distance, across the years, across the chasm of betrayal and loss and impossible resurrection. Then his brother's eyes widened in recognition and something else. Fear? Regret? Resignation? The Alpha King didn't wait to find out. He stepped back from the window, his mind a chaos of emotion and thought, and then, acting on pure instinct, he strode to the cottage door and threw it open. The scene inside the cottage was exactly as he'd glimpsed it through the window, but being physically present made it undeniably, horrifyingly real. His brother stood in the center of the room, face pale but resolute. The maid had backed against the far wall, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with terror. "Brother," the Alpha King said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Hollow. You're supposed to be dead." His brother didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, studying the Alpha King with an expression that mixed sorrow and determination in equal measure. "I am dead," he finally said. "The man you knew, the brother you loved, he died 5 years ago. That much was real." "Don't give me philosophy and riddles," the Alpha King snapped, and now the anger was rising, hot and fierce, burning away the shock. "You're standing here, alive, after letting me believe you were gone, after letting me mourn you, after—" His voice broke and he hated himself for it, hated the weakness it revealed. "After you condemned me for crimes I didn't commit?" His brother's voice was quiet but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "After you chose to believe lies over the truth I told you? After you picked your crown over your family?" The words hit like physical blows. The Alpha King staggered back a step, his mind reeling. "The evidence," he began, but his brother cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Was fabricated, planted, designed to turn you against me by people who wanted to isolate you, to remove anyone who might question their influence over you." His brother stepped forward, his eyes blazing with an intensity the Alpha King remembered all too well. "I told you I was innocent. I begged you to investigate further, to question the convenient timing, the too perfect evidence. But you wouldn't listen. You couldn't see past your precious throne and your paranoid need for control. That's not—" The Alpha King's protest died in his throat because, God's help him, there was truth in those words. He had been paranoid. He had been consumed by his need to secure his power, to eliminate any potential threats. He had wanted to believe his brother. But he had also wanted certainty, security, the elimination of doubt. And so he had chosen to believe the evidence. To doubt his brother. To prioritize his kingdom over his family. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I didn't know the evidence was false." "You didn't want to know," his brother corrected, and the sadness in his voice was somehow worse than the anger had been. "Because knowing would have required you to question everything. Your counselors. Your methods. Your assumption that power and control could substitute for trust and faith." The Alpha King turned to the maid, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, pressed against the wall like she wished she could disappear into it. "And you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How are you part of this? How long have you known?" She swallowed hard and he could see her hands trembling. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "He's my brother," she said simply. The words landed like a hammer blow. The Alpha King stared at her, trying to process this new impossibility layered on top of all the others. "Your brother." She nodded. "I'm not just a maid. I was nobility. From a family your counselors destroyed after they falsely implicated us in your brother's supposed treason. My family lost everything. Our lands, our titles, our fortune. Most of them are dead now. Executed or driven to suicide by the shame and ruin." The Alpha King felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "I never ordered." "You didn't have to order it explicitly," she cut him off, and now her fear had transformed into something fiercer. Bigger. Grief. Accusation. "Your counselors acted with your implicit approval. They knew you wanted anyone connected to the betrayal eliminated. They knew you valued loyalty above all else, and that suspicion of disloyalty was enough for condemnation. So they destroyed us. Systematically. Thoroughly. And you never even noticed because we were beneath your attention." The Alpha King wanted to deny it. To insist that he would have known, would have intervened, would never have permitted such injustice. But the terrible truth was that he hadn't known. Hadn't paid attention. Hadn't cared enough about the collateral damage of his quest for security and control. "I came to the palace to find proof," the maid continued, her voice shaking now but persistent. "Proof that the evidence against your brother was fabricated. Proof that my family was innocent. I've been gathering documents, records, anything that might reveal the truth." "That's what you've been doing," the Alpha King said, understanding dawning with sickening clarity. "The secretive behavior. The phone calls. You were reporting back to? He gestured at his brother. To him. Yes, his brother confirmed. She's been invaluable. Brave beyond measure. Risking her life daily to uncover the conspiracy that destroyed both our families. And have you found this proof? The Alpha King asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. His brother walked to a desk in the corner of the cottage and retrieved a thick folder. He held it out to the Alpha King. Read it, he said. Read it all. The forged documents. The fake witnesses who were paid to lie and then conveniently died before they could recant. The financial trails that lead back to your most trusted advisors. The entire conspiracy laid bare. The Alpha King took the folder with hands that shook. He opened it and began to read. And with each page, each revelation, he felt his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. It was all there. Vivid. Documented. Undeniable. The evidence against his brother had been manufactured by 3 of his closest counselors. Men he had trusted implicitly, men who had guided his decisions for years. They had done it to consolidate their own power, to remove the one person who had questioned their influence and might have exposed their corruption. And the Alpha King had played right into their hands. Had done exactly what they'd wanted. Had removed his brother, isolated himself, made himself dependent on their counsel. He had been a fool. A blind, arrogant fool. Why? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why didn't you come to me before? Why hide for 5 years instead of showing me this? His brother's expression softened slightly. Because 5 years ago you wouldn't have believed it. You wanted to believe I was guilty because it fit your narrative, confirmed your paranoia, justified your ruthlessness. You had to lose everything, your family, your capacity for trust, your humanity, before you'd be capable of seeing the truth. And what makes you think I can see it now? The Alpha King challenged, though his heart wasn't in it. Because you followed her, his brother said, nodding toward the maid. Because you cared enough about one person, one mere servant, to abandon your dignity and your position and track her through the forest at night. Because some small part of you remembered how to feel something other than the need for control. The Alpha King looked at the maid. Really looked at her for the first time. Not as a servant. Not as a spy or conspirator. But as a person. A woman who had lost everything, who had endured degradation and danger to seek justice for her family, who had been brave enough to walk into the palace of the man whose actions had destroyed her life. What's your real name? He asked quietly. She met his gaze and he saw strength there that humbled him. Alara, she said. Lady Alara of House Thornwood. Or what's left of it. House Thornwood. Is he remembered now? Distantly. One of the families accused of supporting his brother's supposed treason. He'd signed the orders for their punishment without even reading the full charges, trusting his counselor's judgment. The weight of that casual cruelty, that thoughtless wielding of absolute power, crashed down on him like a mountain. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. I'm so sorry. For all of it. For what happened to you. To your family. He looked at his brother. To you. His brother studied him for a long moment, and the Alpha King couldn't read the expression on his face. Sorry isn't enough, his brother finally said. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Doesn't restore what was lost. Doesn't undo 5 years of pain and isolation and grief. I know. The Alpha King's voice cracked. I know it's not enough. I know I can never make this right. But He stopped, swallowing hard against the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. I thought I'd lost you. When I believed you were dead, it nearly destroyed me. I shut down. Became the monster you're describing. And now I find out you're alive, but I'd actually already lost you years before. Lost you because of my own failures. My pride. My fear. Something shifted in his brother's expression. A slight softening. A crack in the armor. You did lose me, he said quietly. The brother who trusted you, who believed in you, he did die 5 years ago. But maybe. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Maybe something new could grow from that death. If you're willing to change. Really change. Not just apologize, but actually transform who you are and how you rule. The Alpha King felt something uncurl in his chest. Something that might have been hope. How? He asked. How do I fix this? His brother walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. The first physical contact they'd had in 5 years. You start by exposing the truth, he said. You bring those counselors to justice. You restore the families they destroyed. You acknowledge publicly what was done in your name and take responsibility for it. That would destroy my credibility, the Alpha King said automatically, then stopped himself. But I suppose that's the point. I built that credibility on lies and injustice. It deserves to be destroyed. And then, his brother continued, you rebuild. Not as the Alpha King who rules through fear and control, but as a leader who values truth and justice, who trusts his people instead of suspecting them, who remembers that power is meaningless without compassion. The Alpha King looked between his brother and Alara, these two people who had every reason to hate him, to want revenge, to see him destroyed. Why are you giving me this chance? He asked. After everything I've done to you both, why offer me redemption instead of revenge? Alara spoke up, her voice soft but firm. Because revenge won't bring my family back. Won't heal the wounds. Won't make anything better. But justice might. Real justice. And change. Those might actually mean something. And because you're still my brother, the Alpha King's brother added. Beneath all the layers of crown and title and power, somewhere deep down you're still the person I grew up with. The person who used to care about right and wrong more than winning and losing. I have to believe that person is still in there. Still reachable. The Alpha King felt tears burning in his eyes. When was the last time he'd cried? He couldn't remember. Couldn't remember the last time he'd allowed himself to feel anything this raw, this real. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said. Probably not, his brother agreed with a slight smile. But you're going to get the chance to earn it anyway. That's what family means. The Alpha King looked down at the folder of evidence in his hands. The proof of conspiracy. The documentation of his counselor's betrayal. The tool he needed to begin setting things right. And he realized something that should have terrified him but instead felt oddly liberating. He had completely lost control. Of his emotions. Of his carefully maintained composure. Of the narrative he'd built around his brother's betrayal and death. Of everything he'd thought he understood about his kingdom and his rule. He had lost control and the world hadn't ended. In fact, in losing control he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. He'd gained the truth. The confrontation with his counselors came 3 days later. The Alpha King had spent those days carefully planning, gathering additional evidence, building an ironclad case. He'd also spent time talking with his brother and Alara, beginning the long, difficult process of understanding the full scope of what had been done in his name. When he finally called his council together, they came expecting another routine meeting. Perhaps they noticed something different in his demeanor. A certain coldness, a particular intensity in his gaze. But they assumed it was merely his usual disposition. They were wrong. Gentlemen, the Alpha King began, his voice carrying through the chamber with absolute authority. We're going to discuss treason today. But not the treason you think. He watched their faces carefully as he laid out the evidence. Watched confusion give way to concern. Concern to fear, fear to desperate calculation as they realized their conspiracy had been exposed. They tried to deny it. To deflect. To accuse others. But the Alpha King had learned his lesson about accepting convenient narratives. This time he had proof. Real proof. Undeniable proof. By the end of that day, 3 of his most trusted counselors were in chains, awaiting trial. The shock rippled through the palace, through the kingdom. The infallible Alpha King had been deceived. The unshakable ruler had been manipulated. Many expected him to cover it up. To handle it quietly, preserve the appearance of perfect control and judgment. Instead he made it public. All of it. He stood before his people and admitted that he had been wrong. That he had been deceived. That innocent people had suffered because of his failures. That his own brother had been falsely accused and driven into hiding. He announced his brother's return. He restored the honors of House Thornwood and the other families that had been unjustly destroyed. He acknowledged his role in these injustices and pledged to make amends. The response was unexpected. He'd anticipated outrage. Calls for his abdication. Loss of respect and authority. What he got instead was something he'd never experienced as king. Trust. His people saw a ruler who was willing to admit mistakes. Who valued truth over pride. Who would hold even his closest advisors accountable for wrongdoing. Who cared more about justice than his own image. It didn't happen overnight. Trust never does. But slowly, gradually, the Alpha King felt something shifting in his relationship with his kingdom. He was no longer ruling through fear and intimidation. He was leading through example and integrity. And his brother was there helping him navigate this transformation. Not as a subordinate or an advisor but as an equal. As family. As for Alara, that was more complicated. 3 months after that night in the forest cottage, the Alpha King found himself standing in the garden of the palace, staring at the stars and thinking about control. He'd spent so many years believing that control was everything. That a ruler who showed vulnerability was a ruler inviting destruction. That emotional distance was strength and connection was weakness. He'd been wrong about that too. "You're brooding," a voice said from behind him. He turned to find Alara approaching through the garden path. She was no longer dressed in a maid's uniform. She wore the clothes befitting her restored status as a noblewoman of House Thornwood. But she still moved with that same quiet grace that had first caught his attention all those months ago. "Thinking," he corrected with a slight smile. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She came to stand beside him looking up at the same stars. "Because from here it looks an awful lot like brooding." He laughed softly. When had he started laughing again? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but somewhere in the past few months, joy had crept back into his life. "I was thinking about control," he admitted. "About how desperately I sought it. How much I sacrificed for it. And how meaningless it turned out to be." Alara nodded thoughtfully. "And what have you learned?" "That control is an illusion," he said. "Real power, real strength, comes from accepting that we can't control everything. That we have to trust people. Depend on them. Let them see our weaknesses and our mistakes." "That's very philosophical for someone who once sentenced people to death for disagreeing with him," Alara observed, though her tone was gentle rather than accusatory. "I was a different person then," the Alpha King said. "Or maybe I was just pretending to be someone I wasn't. Playing a role I thought I had to play." "And who are you now?" It was a simple question, but it struck at the heart of everything he'd been wrestling with. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm still figuring that out. But whoever I am, whoever I'm becoming, I know I don't want to do it alone." Alara turned to look at him directly, and in the starlight, her eyes seemed to hold entire galaxies. "You're not alone," she said softly. "You have your brother. Your people. Your kingdom." "I know. But I was thinking about someone more specific." Her breath caught slightly and he saw understanding dawn in her expression. "Your Majesty," she began, but he cut her off gently. "Just my name," he said. "Please. No titles. Not here. Not with you." She nodded slowly. "All right. Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying that when I followed you that night, I told myself it was suspicion. Duty. A king's responsibility to know what was happening in his palace. But that was a lie." He took a deep breath, letting himself be vulnerable in a way that would have been unthinkable just months ago. "The truth is, I followed you because I couldn't not follow you. Because somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, you'd become the most important person in my world. Because the thought of you having secrets, having a life I wasn't part of, was unbearable." "I was your servant," Alara said quietly. "I lied to you every day for months. I invaded your privacy, stole your documents, used my position to betray you. You were seeking justice for your family. Fighting against a terrible wrong. Displaying more courage and integrity than I'd shown in years." He reached out tentatively, taking her hand. "And yes, you lied to me. But everything I built my rule on was a lie. My supposed control. My perfect judgment. My infallible authority. All lies. You at least were lying for a noble cause." She didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't move closer either. "Where does that leave us?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd like to find out. If you're willing. If you can forgive what I did to your family. What I failed to prevent." "I've been working on forgiveness," Alara said slowly. "It's harder than I expected. Some days I think I've managed it. Other days I remember my parents' faces when they realized they'd lost everything, and the anger comes back. I understand. I'll wait. As long as it takes." "You're a king," she pointed out. "You're not used to waiting for anything." "Then it's good practice," he replied. "Learning patience. Learning that some things can't be commanded or controlled. That they have to be earned and given freely." Alara studied him for a long moment and he forced himself not to look away. To let her see him. Really see him. All his flaws and failures and desperate hope for redemption. I don't know if we can ever have something normal, she finally said. There's too much history. Too much pain. You'll always be the king who destroyed my family, even if you've changed. Even if you've made amends. I know. And I'll carry that with me forever. Let it inform every decision I make. Every action I take as king. He squeezed her hand gently. But maybe, alongside that burden, there could also be something else. Something that grows in spite of the past, or perhaps because of it. Something that acknowledges the pain but doesn't let it be the final word. You're asking me to trust you, Elara said. After everything. Yes. I know I don't deserve it. But I'm asking anyway. Not as a king. Just as a man who has finally learned the difference between control and connection. Who's discovered that the things worth having are the things we can't command or compel. Elara smiled then, just a small curve of her lips, but it felt like sunrise. You really have changed, she said. Is that a good thing? I think so. The old you would never have admitted uncertainty. Would never have asked instead of demanded. Would never have. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Would never have followed a maid into the forest because you cared about where she was going and who she was meeting. That was the night I lost control, he said. The night everything fell apart. Or the night everything began coming together, Elara suggested. Sometimes losing control is the only way to find what really matters. He was right. He knew she was right. That night in the forest, when he'd seen his brother alive and learned the truth about the conspiracy and felt his entire world crumbling, that had been the beginning. Not of his fall but of his awakening. He'd spent years building walls. Creating distance. Maintaining control at all costs. And in one night, one impossible revelation, all of it had come crashing down. But from the rubble something new was emerging. Something better. A king who listened. A brother who had been restored. A kingdom built on truth instead of fear. And maybe, if he was very lucky, if he worked very hard at becoming someone worthy of it. A love built not on power or obligation but on mutual respect and hard-won trust. I still have so much to make right, the Alpha King said, looking out at his kingdom at the lights of the city below. So many wrongs to address. So much rebuilding to do. Yes, Elara agreed. You do. Will you help me? Not as a servant. Not as an obligation. But as a partner. As someone who understands what justice really means and won't let me slip back into old patterns. That's a lot to ask, Elara said, but there was warmth in her voice now. I know. But I'm trying to be honest about what I want. What I need. That's progress, right? She laughed and the sound was like music. It's progress. They stood together in silence for a while, hands still linked, looking up at the stars and the vast, unknowable future that stretched before them. The Alpha King had lost control. Had his world shattered. Had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his rule. And somehow, impossibly, he'd found something better on the other side of that chaos. He'd found himself. So let me ask you, what do you think happens next? Does the Alpha King succeed in his transformation, or will old habits and the weight of power drag him back to his former ways? Can Elara truly forgive the man who, however unwittingly, destroyed her family? Can a king who built his rule on control learn to lead through trust? And most importantly, what would you do in his position? If you discovered that everything you'd built was based on lies, that your most trusted advisors had betrayed you, that your quest for control had blinded you to truth and justice, could you let it all go? Could you embrace the vulnerability that comes with really, truly connecting with others? These are the questions the Alpha King grapples with every day now. And these are the questions we all face in our own ways in our own lives. Because here's the truth about control. It's seductive. It promises safety and certainty in an uncertain world. It tells us that if we just plan enough, work hard enough, build high enough walls, we can protect ourselves from pain and loss and betrayal. But it's a lie. The only real safety comes from connection. From letting people in despite the risk. From trusting even when trust has been broken. From choosing vulnerability over invulnerability. The Alpha King learned this the hard way. Through loss and revelation and the shattering of everything he thought he knew. But he learned it. And now he has a choice. He can try to rebuild his walls, restore his control, return to the safety of emotional distance. Or he can stay open. Stay vulnerable. Keep reaching out even when it's terrifying. The same choice faces Alara. She can hold on to her anger, her grief, her justified rage at what was done to her family. Or she can take the risk of trusting again, of believing that people can change, that redemption is possible. Neither choice is easy. Neither path is guaranteed to lead to happiness. But that's the thing about letting go of control. You don't get guarantees anymore. You get possibilities instead. The Alpha King followed his maid into the forest that night because something in him, some part that still remembered how to feel, how to care, how to be human beneath the crown, wouldn't let him turn away. What he discovered shattered his world. Destroyed his carefully constructed sense of order and control. Forced him to confront his worst failures and most painful truths. And it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Because in losing control he found freedom. In facing his mistakes he found the path to redemption. In acknowledging his vulnerability he found strength. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. The thing that made him lose control was also the thing that set him free. So I'll ask again, what do you think? Is transformation possible? Can a ruler built on control learn to lead through trust? Can a relationship born from deception and pain become something real and lasting? I don't have all the answers. The Alpha King doesn't have all the answers. That's kind of the point. But I believe, and I think he's starting to believe, that some questions are more important than their answers. That the journey toward truth and connection and love is more valuable than any destination. The Alpha King's story isn't over. It's just beginning. And where it leads from here, well, that depends on the choices he makes. The courage he finds. The trust he builds. And maybe, just maybe, on the grace and forgiveness of a woman who has every reason to hate him but chooses, despite everything, to give him a chance. Because that's what love is in the end. Not control. Not possession. Not the desperate grasping for certainty in an uncertain world. Love is the choice to stay open when everything in you wants to close off. To trust when trust seems foolish. To believe in the possibility of change and redemption and new beginnings. The Alpha King lost control. And in losing it he found everything that truly matters. What will he do with this second chance? How will he navigate the complex path ahead? Can he balance the demands of leadership with the vulnerability of genuine connection? Those stories are still being written. Still unfolding. But I'll be watching. Wondering. Hoping. Because if an Alpha King can learn to let go of control, to embrace vulnerability, to choose connection over isolation, then maybe there's hope for all of us. Maybe we can all learn to stop building walls and start building bridges. Maybe we can all find the courage to follow our hearts into dark forests, not knowing what we'll discover, but trusting that whatever it is, it will be worth the journey. Maybe we can all learn that losing control isn't the end of the world. Sometimes it's just the beginning.